The tribunal chamber smelled like cold metal and old silence, and Cadet Javan Reyes stood in the center of it with his hands behind his back and his chin up, because that was the only thing left they had not taken from him. 6 alien officers sat behind a curved black bench that floated 2 meters off the ground, their faces lit from below by holographic case files that painted them all in shades of blue and gold, and not a single one of them looked at Javan like he was a person. Commandant Sarith Vosk sat at the center, tallest of them all, a Draelith whose scaled skin shifted between dark green and black depending on his mood, and right now it was very black indeed. His vertical pupils were locked onto Javan the way a predator locks onto something it has already decided to kill, but wants to watch struggle first. "Cadet Reyes," Vosk said, and his voice was the kind of deep that you felt in your ribs more than you heard with your ears. "You are charged with insubordination and reckless endangerment during Fleet Exercise Talon 7. You broke formation without authorization, deviated from your assigned patrol vector, and engaged in an unauthorized rescue operation that compromised the tactical integrity of the entire exercise." Javan wanted to laugh, but he kept his face still. What Vosk had just described in that cold and mechanical way was the moment Javan had seen a damaged Korathi frigate spinning toward a gas giant with 32 living beings aboard, and Command had marked it as acceptable losses, and Javan had said no. He had pulled his tiny training shuttle out of formation and burned every drop of fuel he had to reach that frigate and lock onto its hull and fire his emergency thrusters to push them both out of the gravity well. And it had worked, and 32 Korathi were alive today because of it. Nobody in this room cared about that. "How do you answer these charges?" Vosk asked. Javan looked up at the bench and said, "I saved 32 lives, sir." "That was not the question. It is the only answer I have." Something shifted in the chamber. 2 of the officers on the bench exchanged a glance, and Javan caught it, a tiny flicker of something that might have been discomfort or might have been pity. But Vosk did not flinch because Vosk had been building toward this moment for a long time. From the day Javan had arrived at the Aegis Military Academy on Presidium Ethon, Vosk had made it clear that humans did not belong here. Humans were a juvenile species, admitted to the Galactic Union only 30 years ago, tolerated the way you tolerate an insect that somehow found its way into a formal dinner, and the idea that one of them could train alongside Draelith and Tessari and Korathi cadets was an insult to everything Vosk believed in. Javan had endured it, the sabotaged equipment, the impossible schedules, the grading curves that bent like broken bones whenever his scores got too high, and he had endured it all with a grin and a shrug, because his mother had told him before he left New Cebu that the universe would try to make him small, and his only job was to refuse. But this was different. This was not a rigged exam or a missing uniform. This was the end. "The tribunal finds Cadet Reyes guilty," Vosk announced, and he did not even pretend to consult the others, and sentences him to a solo survival assessment on the surface of Calith 9 for a duration of 30 standard days. The chamber went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Javan knew about Calith 9. Every cadet did. It was a Class Omega death world, a quarantined jungle planet with gravity nearly twice standard, toxic atmosphere, electromagnetic storms that killed most technology, and predators that the Union's best xenobiologists simply labeled, "Do not engage." It was the kind of place that appeared in horror stories told by species who had conquered faster-than-light travel but still feared the dark. No cadet had survived a 30-day assessment on Calith 9 in 200 years. Vosk knew this. Everyone in the room knew this. This was not a test, it was an execution dressed up in paperwork. Javan felt his heart hammering, but he did not let it show on his face because that was the one thing he could still control, and he looked at Vosk and said, "I accept." The flicker of surprise in Vosk's eyes was small, but Javan caught it and held onto it like a warm stone in a cold hand. He was given 6 hours to prepare. The rules allowed him one blade, one emergency medkit, one multi-tool, a fire starter, and personal effects weighing no more than 2 kilograms. He packed in 4 hours and spent the remaining 2 sitting on his bunk staring at the ceiling, while the weight of what was about to happen settled over him like water. His only real friend at the academy, a wiry communications specialist named Tish, who was an Ovari with skin like liquid silver and eyes that changed color with every emotion, came to see him before the drop. "This is murder, Joe," Tish said, and his skin was dark gray, which meant he was afraid. "Probably," Javan said. "You could appeal to the Senate, you could. By the time the Senate reviews anything, I will already be on that planet, and Vosk knows it. This was designed so that the paperwork arrives after the body." Tish stared at him and said, "What are you going to do?" Javan reached under his bunk and pulled out a battered rectangular device about the size of his forearm. It was scuffed and dented and held together in one corner by adhesive tape, and it was the most important thing he owned. "What is that?" Tish asked. "Hollow recorder. I call her the Rig. She has been with me since I was 15 and she has never let me down." "You are taking a camera to a death world." "I am taking a witness," Javan said, and he smiled in a way that made Tish's skin shift to a color the Ovari had no word for. The drop shuttle was automated and windowless, and it shook so hard on atmospheric entry that Javan bit his tongue and tasted copper. The electromagnetic interference hit like a wall, and every system on the shuttle screamed warnings before going dark one by one. By the time the shuttle punched through the cloud layer and slammed into the surface on emergency landing thrusters, the only thing still working was the mechanical door release. Javan pulled the lever and the hatch opened. The air hit him first. It was hot and thick and tasted like metal and acid and something alive, something green and rotting and growing all at the same time. It filled his lungs and burned, and then his body did what human bodies had always done. It adapted, it adjusted, it kept going. A Dralith would have choked. A Korathi would have needed a respirator. Javan coughed twice and then breathed. The jungle was enormous in a way that made the word jungle feel too small. Ferns taller than buildings rose in every direction, their fronds dripping with bioluminescent sap that glowed pale blue and green in the dim light. Vines as thick as his torso hung like the rigging of ancient ships. The ground was soft and dark and alive with things that crawled and clicked and watched him with too many eyes. The gravity pressed down on him like a hand on his shoulders. Every step would cost more here, every breath would be work, every movement a negotiation with a planet that wanted him flat on the ground. And somewhere out there in the green dark, something screamed. It was not a sound made by a mouth he could imagine. It was deep and layered, and it vibrated at a frequency that Javan felt in his teeth and his spine and the backs of his eyes. He stood in the hatch of the dead shuttle on a world that had killed everything the galaxy had ever sent to it. And he was alone, truly alone, more alone than any human being should ever have to be. He reached into his pack and pulled out the rig. He turned it on. The red recording light blinked once and held steady. And in that tiny, red glow Javan found something that the Tribunal and the Commandant and the entire Galactic Union had not managed to take from him. He found defiance. He pointed the camera at his own face, at the sweat and the fear and the bruise on his jaw where he had bitten down too hard, and he grinned. "Day 1, he said, Calith 9. Gravity is a nightmare, the air tastes like battery acid, and something out there just screamed in a frequency I felt in my teeth. So, you know, the usual Tuesday." He stepped out of the shuttle and into the jungle, and behind him the hatch sealed itself, and the shuttle began its automated return cycle, rising into the sky and vanishing into the clouds, taking with it the last piece of civilization Javan would see for 30 days. He did not look back. He walked forward, the rig recording, the jungle closing around him like a living mouth, and he kept talking because talking meant he was still here, still breathing, still refusing to be the corpse that Commandant Sareth Vosk had already written into his report. The trees swallowed him whole, and the planet hummed with hunger, and Javan Reyes walked deeper into the dark with nothing but a knife and a camera, and the stubborn human certainty that survival was not something the universe gave you. It was something you took. By the third day, Javan had stopped flinching at every sound and started listening instead, and that made all the difference. The jungle of Calith 9 was not quiet. It was never quiet. It breathed and clicked and growled and sang in frequencies that ranged from deep rumbles he felt in his chest to high whistles that made his ears ring. And within those sounds were patterns, warnings, invitations, and borders that the creatures of this world understood the way Javan understood traffic signals back on New Cebu. He learned fast because humans had always learned fast. It was the thing about his species that the galaxy never seemed to respect but could never quite explain away. Put a human in a new environment, and the human would not dominate it or conquer it, but would instead watch and listen and adapt and bend until the environment and the human reached some kind of stubborn agreement. By day 3, he had built a shelter. It was ugly, but it was strong, raised 2 meters off the ground on legs made from hardened fungal wood that he had cut with his blade and lashed together with vine fiber. The elevation kept him above the crawling things that hunted the forest floor at night, and the broad leaves he had layered over the frame kept out the worst of the toxic spore drifts that rolled through the canopy every few hours. By day 5, he had identified 11 things he could eat. This was the part that would have amazed any xenobiologist in the Union, because most of those plants contained alkaloids that would have stopped a Dralith heart in seconds. But human biochemistry was a strange and ancient thing built on a planet that had spent 4 billion years trying to poison its own children. And Javan's body shrugged off compounds that would have been classified as chemical weapons on any civilized world. He ate bitter roots and sour fungus, and something that tasted almost like the mango his mother grew in her garden if he closed his eyes and did not think too hard about the color. And he survived. And every night he sat in his shelter with the rig propped on his knee, and he talked. Day 5, he said into the camera, his face lit by the pale blue glow of bioluminescent sap he had smeared on the walls for light. I figured out that the big ferns close their fronds about an hour before the spore storms hit, so if you watch the ferns you can predict the storms. It is like having a weather channel made of plants. Honestly, it is better than most weather channels I have seen. He paused and something howled in the distance, and he tilted his head and listened, and then looked back at the camera. That one is what I am calling a groaner. It comes through every night around this time heading east. I think it is territorial, marking the edges of its range with sound. As long as I stay out of its path, it leaves me alone. We have an understanding, me and the groaner, very professional relationship. He grinned, and the grin was tired but real. On day 7, everything changed. He had been following a water source, a narrow stream of dark liquid that was not exactly water, but was close enough that his filter kit could make it safe. And the stream led him downhill through a thicket of razor-edged plants that he navigated carefully and into a clearing that was wide and open and wrong. He knew it was wrong because the clearing was too clean. Nothing grew in its center, and the ground was packed hard and marked with deep grooves, and the air smelled different here, sharper, thicker with something animal and hot. This was a territory. Something lived here, something big enough that the jungle gave it space. Javan should have turned around. Any rational being would have turned around. The training manuals he had studied at the academy would have told him to withdraw and find an alternate route and avoid contact with apex-level fauna at all costs. But Javan heard something that made him stay. It was a sound halfway between a growl and a whimper, low and ragged and broken, and it was coming from the far edge of the clearing, where a mass of dark shapes huddled against a fallen tree. He moved closer. Every step was a choice, every meter a gamble, and the rig was recording because the rig was always recording now. He saw her. She was of Vrexith. He recognized the species from the Academy xenobiology files that had described them as six-legged apex predators with adaptive camouflage plating, jaws capable of shearing starship hull metal, hyper-aggressive, zero domestication potential, and a threat rating so high that the file simply said avoidance is the only viable strategy. She was the size of a horse, maybe bigger, with 6 powerful legs and a body covered in plates that shifted color constantly, cycling through grays and greens and blacks as if her skin could not decide what she was supposed to look like. Her head was broad and heavy, with a jaw that could have closed around Javan's entire torso. And she was hurt. A massive barbed thorn from a razor fern was buried deep in her left forelimb, driven in so far that the flesh around it had swollen dark purple and hot with infection. She was lying on her side, breathing in short, harsh gasps, her 6 legs twitching with pain, and she was starving because she could not hunt like this. She saw Javan and she charged. Even injured, even half-dead with fever, she was terrifyingly fast. She covered the distance between them in 2 heartbeats, and Javan threw himself sideways and rolled across the hard ground, feeling the 1.7 gravity slam him down like a punishment, and her jaws snapped shut in the space where his head had been. He came up on his knees with his hands open and empty, and he did the thing that no Union species would have done. He talked to her. "Easy," he said, and his voice was soft and steady, the voice his grandmother used to use when the water buffalo on their farm got spooked during monsoon season, the voice that said, "I am here and I am not a threat and I am not leaving. Easy, big girl, I know it hurts. I can see it hurts. I am not going to make it worse." She lunged again, but slower this time, and he dodged again and kept talking, and she stood there swaying with pain and fury, and looked at him with eyes that were gold and deep and full of something that was not mindless at all. Javan backed away to the edge of the clearing, and he sat down. He waited. For 48 hours he camped at the edge of her territory, and he did not advance and he did not retreat. He built a small fire and cooked strips of dried meat from a creature he had trapped the day before, and he left pieces of that meat on the ground between them, closer each time, and he talked constantly in that same low, steady voice. She growled at him, she snarled. She dragged herself upright and bared teeth that gleamed like polished steel, but she did not charge again, and eventually she ate the meat. On day 9 she collapsed. The fever had taken her, and she lay on her side with her breath coming in shallow waves and her camouflage plates flickering weakly like a dying light. Javan walked to her and knelt beside her, and she was too weak to stop him. "I know," he said. "I know this is going to be bad, but I need you to trust me for about 5 minutes, and then you can go back to wanting to eat me." He gripped the barbed thorn with both hands and pulled. She screamed. It was a sound that shook the trees and sent every creature within a kilometer running for cover. She thrashed, and one of her legs caught Javan across the chest and threw him 3 meters, and he felt something crack, but he got up and came back because that was what humans did. They got up and came back. The thorn came free on the second try, trailing dark infected blood, and Javan packed the wound with antiseptic from his medkit, and a poultice he had made from local fungi that had antibacterial properties, and he stitched the torn flesh with hands that were shaking so badly he could barely thread the suture. She lay still through the stitching, watching him with those gold eyes, panting, trembling, alive. He sat back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for. By day 12, she was following him through the jungle, limping but stronger every day. By day 14, she was sleeping beside his shelter, her 6 legs curled beneath her and her massive head resting on the ground near his feet, and her camouflage plates had settled into a steady warm bronze that Javan had never seen in any xenobiology file. He named her Mala, after a word in his grandmother's language that meant fierce little one, which was a joke because she was not little at all. On the night of day 14, an electromagnetic storm rolled across the continent, and the sky turned white with lightning, and the thunder was so deep it made the trees sway, and Javan huddled in his shelter shaking, because the cold came with the storms and the gravity made everything heavier and he was tired, so tired. Mala stood up and walked to him, and she curled her massive body around his shelter, 6 legs forming a cage of muscle and armor and warmth. And the sound she made was not a growl, but a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floor and into Javan's bones. He put his hand against her flank and felt her heartbeat, and it was strong and slow and certain. He picked up the rig and looked into it, and his eyes were wet, and his voice was rough. "Day 14, he said. "I came here alone. I do not think I am any more." Outside the storm raged and the planet screamed, and Javan closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 weeks he was not afraid. The monsoon was coming, and Javan could feel it in the way the jungle changed around him, in the way the insects moved higher into the canopy, and the ground creatures burrowed deeper, and the air grew heavier each day like the planet was taking a long, slow breath before something terrible. He had studied Calith 9's weather patterns in the Academy files, and he knew what was coming. The 10-day monsoon cycle would flood the lowland jungles under 15 meters of acidic water, and anything caught in the lowlands when the rains hit would drown or dissolve or both. They had to move to higher ground, and they had to do it now. "Day 16, Javan said into the rig as he packed his shelter into a bundle on his back, heading for the highland plateau to the northeast. It is about 80 kilometers through some of the worst terrain on this planet, which is saying something because all terrain on this planet is the worst terrain. Mala seems to know where we are going, which is encouraging because I absolutely do not." Mala stood at the edge of the clearing, her gold eyes fixed on the tree line to the northeast, her camouflage plates shifting to match the deep green of the surrounding jungle. She looked back at Javan and made a low sound in her throat that he had learned to recognize as impatience. "Yes, I am coming," he said. "Some of us only have 2 legs, Your Majesty." The first test came on day 16 when the spore storm hit. Javan had been watching the ferns and he saw them close their fronds, and he knew he had maybe 30 minutes before the air became a thick toxic fog of reproductive spores that would coat his lungs and suffocate him in a way that was both disgusting and extremely permanent. He had no respirator because the electromagnetic interference had killed it on day 2, and so he did what humans had always done when technology failed. He improvised. He cut strips of dense plant fiber from a species of moss that grew on the northern sides of the larger trees, and he layered them with sap resin from the bioluminescent ferns, and he pressed them together and shaped them, and within 20 minutes, he had built a breathing filter that fit over his nose and mouth and looked terrible but worked. The spore storm rolled through like a yellow-green wall of death, and Javan breathed through his ugly little mask and watched as Mala's camouflage plates sealed shut over her respiratory slits with a soft clicking sound. A biological defense evolved over millions of years on a world that was constantly trying to kill its own inhabitants. He filmed her doing it, and even through the mask his voice carried wonder. "Did you see that?" he said to the camera. "Her plates sealed completely. She has built-in environmental protection. This species has adapted to every single threat this planet can throw at them. They are not just predators, they are survivors, the same way we are, and the Union classified them as mindless. The Union was wrong." Day 18 brought the ravine. It split the jungle floor like a wound, 60 meters wide and deep enough that Javan could not see the bottom through the mist that rose from whatever was down there. The sound that came up from the depths was wet and hungry, and he decided very quickly that he did not want to know what made it. There was no way around. The ravine stretched in both directions as far as he could see, and the monsoon was getting closer. Javan looked at the ravine and looked at the trees, and looked at the vines that hung between them, and he started building. It took him 6 hours to rig a traverse. He cut vines and tested their strength and wove them together, and anchored them to the thickest trees on both sides using a throwing technique he had learned as a child when his uncles taught him to fish with nets from the cliffs of New Cebu. The bridge was crude and it swayed in the wind, and it was the most terrifying thing he had ever built. Mala watched him work with what he had come to recognize as an expression of deep skepticism. "Do not judge me," he told her. She looked at the ravine and then at him, and then she backed up 20 meters and ran and launched herself across the gap in a single impossible leap, 60 meters of open air beneath her, and landed on the far side with a grace that made Javan want to quit and go home. She turned and looked at him from across the chasm and made that impatient sound again. "Show off," Javan muttered, and he started across his bridge. The crossing took 45 minutes and the vines creaked and the mist below him shifted, and something down there saw him and made a sound of interest, and Javan did not look down. He absolutely did not look down, and when he finally pulled himself onto solid ground on the far side, his arms were shaking and his legs were rubber. Mala walked up to him and pressed her broad head against his chest hard enough to nearly knock him over, and the sound she made was warm and low, and Javan wrapped his arms around her head and laughed until he cried. The rig caught all of it. Day 20 was the swarm. They came at night, thousands of them, insectoids the size of Javan's fist with barbed stingers that delivered a venom designed to paralyze prey so it could be consumed alive. They poured out of a nest in the ground that Javan had unknowingly camped too close to, and the sound of their wings was like static, like white noise, like the universe had turned the volume up on something horrible. Javan fought with fire, swinging a burning branch in wide arcs that drove them back but did not stop them. Mala fought with her body, her jaws snapping shut on clusters of them, her plates flaring wide to expose the bioluminescent patterns beneath in a display that confused and scattered the swarm in waves. It lasted 2 hours. When it was over, they were both covered in bites and ichor, and Javan's left arm was swollen to twice its size, and Mala had a dozen stingers embedded in the gaps between her plates, and they sat together in the ruined camp, breathing hard and bleeding. Javan pulled the stingers from Mala's hide one by one while she grumbled and flinched, and then she turned and licked his swollen arm with a tongue that was rough as sandpaper and surprisingly gentle. "Day 20, he said to the rig, and he was laughing even though nothing was funny. "The swarm tried to eat us. We are both still here. I think my arm might fall off, but Mala seems to think her spit has healing properties, so we are testing that theory. This is what passes for medicine on Calith 9. Day 23 nearly ended everything. The male Vrexith found them at dawn. He was enormous, twice Mala's size, fully mature, with plates that were dark as obsidian and eyes that burned red instead of gold. He emerged from the tree line like a nightmare given weight and muscle and teeth, and he looked at Javan the way a Vrexith was supposed to look at prey. Mala put herself between them. She was smaller and still healing and outmatched in every way that could be measured, but she planted her 6 legs and lowered her head, and the sound she made was not the warm hum she gave Javan at night. It was a roar that shook the air and split the morning apart. The fight was fast and vicious and terrible to watch. They collided with a force that cracked the ground beneath them, and Javan saw claws and teeth and blood and plates torn free, and he stood there with his knife in his hand knowing it was useless, knowing that against creatures like these he was nothing, and watching the creature he loved fight for his life. Mala won. She was faster and she was desperate, and desperation in a Vrexith was a weapon all its own. She caught the male's throat in her jaws and held until he submitted, and when he pulled free and retreated into the jungle bleeding and beaten, she stood swaying in the clearing with a deep gash across her flank that showed muscle and bone. Javan stitched her up for the second time with hands that shook and tears running down his face that he did not bother to hide from the camera. "She fought for me," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "She did not have to. She could have let him have me and walked away. She fought for me." They reached the highland plateau on day 25, and that was where Javan found the ruins. They rose from the jungle like bones from skin, massive stone structures covered in creeping vines and glowing moss, with archways tall enough for a starship to pass through, and walls carved with symbols that no living language could translate. Calith 9 was supposed to be a primordial world, a planet without history, without civilization, without anything but teeth and hunger. But someone had been here. Someone had built here. Someone had lived and thought and created on this world that the Union had dismissed as nothing but a grave. Javan walked through the ruins with the rig held high, and his mouth open, and Mala padded beside him, and neither of them made a sound because some places demand silence even from those who do not understand why. Day 25, Javan said later, sitting on the edge of a stone platform that overlooked the jungle below, the triple moons rising in colors of white and amber and pale violet. I found something no one knows about. A civilization lived on this death world, and they built things that have lasted longer than the Union itself. I do not know what this means, but I know it matters. Mala lay beside him, her flank warm against his leg, her breathing slow and steady, and the jungle stretched out below them green and endless and alive. 5 days left, he said. I am supposed to want to leave. He looked at Mala and she looked at him, and the triple moons cast their light over both of them. I am not sure I do. The extraction shuttle arrived on day 30 exactly on schedule, because the Union was nothing if not punctual even when it expected to be picking up a corpse. It descended through the atmosphere of Calith 9 on autopilot, its system screaming warnings as the electromagnetic interference tore through its sensors, and it landed at the designated coordinates in a clearing on the highland plateau with a mechanical precision that felt almost insulting in its indifference. The shuttle did not care whether Javan Reyes was alive or dead. It was simply following its program, wait 6 hours and then return. Javan heard it before he saw it, the high whine of atmospheric engines cutting through the jungle noise, and he stood up from the stone platform where he had spent the last 5 days cataloging the ruins and filming everything the rig could hold. He looked at Mala. She was watching the shuttle with her plates shifting rapidly through colors he had never seen before, dark reds and bright silvers, and a deep violet that he had come to understand meant uncertainty. She did not know what this thing was, this metal creature that had fallen from the sky, and her body was tense with the readiness to fight or run. It is okay, Javan said, and he put his hand on her flank the way he had done 100 times now. That is our ride home. Well, my ride. I do not know if you... He stopped because he realized he had not thought about this. He had been so focused on surviving, and then on the ruins and the vlogs, and the day-to-day reality of living on a death world, that he had not considered the simple, terrible question of what happened next. Could he bring her? Should he bring her? She was a wild creature, an apex predator born on a world that had shaped her into something magnificent and deadly, and the idea of putting her in a metal box and flying her to a space station full of species that would be terrified of her felt wrong in a way he could not quite name. But the idea of leaving her felt worse. Mala made the decision for him. She walked past him toward the shuttle and stood at the closed hatch and looked back at him with those gold eyes and made the impatient sound, the one that meant you are being slow, and I do not have time for this. Javan laughed, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and surprised, and he followed her. The shuttle's automated systems registered them both as they boarded. It flagged Javan's biosignature as matching the expected passenger manifest, and then it flagged Mala as a non-standard biological payload, and flashed a warning on the console that said Unauthorized Organism DETECTED, Quarantine Protocol Recommended. Javan sat down in the pilot's seat and entered his cadet override codes and dismissed the warning. She is with me, he said to no one because the shuttle had no one to hear him. Get used to it. The flight to Presidium Ethon took 4 hours, and Mala spent most of it pressed against the far wall of the cargo bay, her plates cycling through anxious colors as the stars moved outside the viewport. Javan sat beside her and talked to her the whole way because that was what worked. That was what had always worked. The steady sound of a human voice saying, "I am here and you are safe, and we are doing this together." When the shuttle docked at the Academy's main bay, the hatch opened, and Javan stepped out into artificial light for the first time in 30 days, and the brightness made him squint, and the regulated air tasted flat and dead, after a month of breathing a world that was alive in every molecule. He looked different. He had lost 10 kilograms and gained scars that would never fully fade. His Academy uniform was gone, replaced by improvised armor made from Vrexith shed scales and hardwood lashed together with vine cord. His face was leaner, older, and his eyes had something in them that had not been there before, a calm that came from having been afraid every single day and choosing to keep going anyway. Behind him, Mala emerged from the shuttle, and the docking bay erupted into chaos. Security teams scrambled. Weapons were drawn. Alarms blared through the station corridors. Officers and cadets who had gathered out of curiosity pressed against the observation windows and stared with a mixture of horror and fascination at the six-legged predator that had just walked calmly out of a shuttle and was now standing in the middle of their pristine military facility. Mala growled, and the sound resonated through the deck plating and rattled the bones of every being within 50 meters. Javan stepped forward with his hand on her flank, and his voice carried across the bay with a clarity that surprised even him. "She is with me. Lower your weapons or she will take it personally." Nobody lowered their weapons, but nobody fired either, and that was enough for the moment. Commandant Sarith Vosk arrived 12 minutes later, flanked by 4 armed guards, and his scales were so black they seemed to absorb the light around him. He walked into the docking bay and stopped, and for 3 full seconds he simply stared at Javan Reyes, standing there alive and armored in the skin of a death world with an apex predator at his side. The shock on Vosk's face was brief, but Javan saw it and the rig saw it, and that was all that mattered. "This creature will be destroyed and you will submit to quarantine," Vosk said, and his voice was controlled, but something underneath it was cracking. "You have violated the terms of your assessment by..." "By what?" A new voice cut in, sharp and clear and unafraid. Instructor Maylis Rose stepped through the security line, all 4 arms folded across her chest, her Tessari features set in an expression that Javan had learned during training meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She had been barred from speaking at his tribunal, but no one had barred her from the docking bay. "Academy Regulation 714, she said, looking directly at Vosk. "Any resources, tools, or allies acquired during a survival assessment are the lawful property of the assessed cadet. That regulation was written for salvaged equipment, but it does not specify equipment. It says resources and allies. And unless you would like to argue before the Senate that this creature is neither a resource nor an ally, I suggest you stand down, Commandant." Vosk's jaw tightened and his claws scraped the deck, but he said nothing because Maylis was right, and everyone in the bay knew it. Javan filed his assessment report that evening. Academy protocol required a written account and any supporting documentation. And Javan submitted his written account, along with 212 hours of unedited holo recordings from the rig. What happened next was not something Javan planned or expected, or could have predicted. Tish happened. The young Ilvari communications specialist whose skin changed with every emotion, and who had come to say goodbye before the drop, and who had been quietly furious for 30 days waiting to find out if his only human friend was alive. Tish took the recordings that had been submitted to the Academy's internal review system and uploaded them to the Union's open academic network. He did it under the cover of peer review documentation, which was technically allowed and practically unprecedented. And by the time anyone thought to stop it, The files had been copied and shared and mirrored across 1,000 nodes. Within 72 hours, the vlogs of Javan Rays were the most watched content in the history of the Galactic Union's civilian networks. Billions of beings across thousands of worlds watched a human survive a death world. They watched him build shelters and identify food and improvise technology from raw jungle materials. They watched him find an injured predator that should have killed him and sit with it for 2 days offering meat and speaking softly until it let him help. They watched him pull a thorn from a creature's flesh while it screamed and stitched the wound with shaking hands. They watched him cross a ravine on a bridge made of vines while laughing and swearing. They watched him cry when Mala was hurt and laugh when she stole his food, and talk to her at night like she was the most important person in his life. They watched a human being, fully and completely and without performance, on a world that was supposed to kill him. The reactions came like a flood. Civilians across the Union were captivated. Humans had always been an abstraction to most species, a strange, soft, short-lived species from a scary little planet. But now they had a face and a voice and a story, and the story was extraordinary. Javan Rays became the most famous human in the galaxy not because he was special, but because he was completely and utterly human, and it turned out that was enough. Xenobiologists were electrified by the Vrexith bonding footage and the ruins he had discovered. Military analysts were disturbed because a single human with a knife and a camera had done what the Union's best teams could not. The Draelith political bloc was furious because the vlogs made Vosk's exile order look like exactly what it was. The Senate of Aligned Worlds launched a formal inquiry. Vosk tried to fight it. He argued the assessment was standard procedure, that Javan had cheated by bonding with a local creature, that the vlogs were edited propaganda. Maylis Rowe testified and dismantled every claim with the precision of a surgeon. Tish provided metadata proving the recordings were completely unedited. 3 Korathi officers from the frigate Javan had saved came forward to tell the Senate what had really happened during Fleet Exercise Talon 7. And then Javan was called to speak. He walked into the Senate chamber in his cadet uniform, clean for the first time in a month, and Mala walked beside him, and she was calm and her plates had settled into that warm bronze that meant she was content, and the entire chamber of 2,000 representatives from across the galaxy held their breath. Javan's testimony was short. He did not make speeches or accusations. He stood at the podium and said he wanted to show them one thing. He played the recording from Night 14, the electromagnetic storm, the jungle lit white with lightning, and Mala curling her body around his shelter, and the sound she made, that low, steady hum that meant safe and here and mine. "You sent me to die on a world you were afraid of," Javan said into the silence that followed, "and I found a friend there. I think the Union has a lot of worlds it is afraid of and a lot of friends it has not met yet. Maybe that is what humans are for." The silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then from the public gallery someone began to clap, and the sound spread like fire. The Senate voted on a clear autumn morning aboard Presidium Ethon, when the station's artificial sky was painted in shades of amber and gold, and the vote was not close. Commandant Sareth Vosk was formally censured by a margin of 1,700 to 206, stripped of his position as head of the Aegis Military Academy, and placed under criminal investigation for abuse of authority and conduct, endangering the life of a Union cadet. It was the first time in the history of the Galactic Union that a Draelith officer of his rank had been brought down by a formal Senate action, and the political shockwave rippled through every corridor of power in the galaxy. Vosk stood in the Senate chamber as the verdict was read, and his scales were the darkest black Javan had ever seen, and his vertical pupils were fixed on some point in the middle distance, as though he was looking at a future that no longer existed. He did not speak. He did not protest. He simply turned and walked out through a side door flanked by Union security officers, and Javan never saw him again. Javan watched him go and felt nothing like triumph. What he felt was tired, the deep kind of tired that lives in your bones and takes weeks to leave, and he felt relief. And he felt the warm pressure of Mala's flank against his leg, where she sat beside him on the Senate floor like a sphinx carved from bronze and muscle. The Senate did more than punish Vosk, they created something new. They called it the Raise Provision. It was a regulation requiring independent oversight of all survival assessments at every military academy in the Union, prohibiting the use of quarantined worlds as punishment assignments, and mandating that any solo assessment on a world rated above Class Delta required Senate approval and a full review board. It was a small law in the grand scheme of galactic governance, but it meant that what had been done to Javan could never be done to anyone else, and sometimes small laws are the ones that matter most. Then there was the matter of Mala. She could not be classified as a pet because she was clearly too intelligent and too dangerous, and too much her own creature for that word to mean anything. She could not be classified as a citizen because the Union had requirements for citizenship that included language and legal comprehension, and the ability to fill out forms which Mala had shown no interest in whatsoever. She could not be classified as wildlife, because she had voluntarily left her planet and voluntarily bonded with a sentient being, and voluntary choice implied something that wildlife was not supposed to have. In the end, the Senate created a new classification just for her: bonded companion, non-citizen sapient adjacent. It was a mouthful, and Javan hated it, and Mala ignored it completely, which was probably the correct response. The months that followed changed the galaxy in ways that Javan did not fully understand while they were happening. Human enrollment at the Aegis Academy tripled in the next admissions cycle. Young humans from colony worlds across the Union applied in numbers that overwhelmed the processing systems, inspired not by military ambition, but by the image of a young man from New Cebu who had walked onto a death world with a knife and walked off it with a friend. They came because Javan had shown them that being human was not something to apologize for. But it was not only humans who changed. Other species began requesting human cadets as training partners and squad mates. Korathi commanders specifically asked for humans on joint exercises. Tessari instructors incorporated Javan's survival techniques into their curricula. Even some younger Draelith officers quietly began questioning the orthodoxy of species hierarchy that their elders had taught them. The reason was simple, and it was the thing that the Union's data models and threat assessments and intelligence analyses had never been able to quantify. Humans made everything around them more alive. They bonded, they adapted, they connected. They cared with a ferocity that was both irrational and irresistible. And the galaxy had watched Javan do all of those things on camera for 30 days, and something fundamental had shifted. Calith 9 was reclassified from Quarantined Death World to Protected Research World after the footage of the ruins prompted the largest archaeological survey in Union history. 300 scientists from 40 species descended on the Highland Plateau, and what they found changed the understanding of galactic history forever. The ruins belonged to a civilization that had existed 50,000 years before the founding of the Union. A species that had lived and thrived on one of the deadliest planets in known space and had built structures so advanced that their engineering principles were still being studied years later. They had disappeared for reasons no one yet understood, but they had left behind proof that a death world was not a dead end. It was a crucible, and what survived the crucible could be extraordinary. Javan's casual, curious vlogging, his instinct to point the camera at anything interesting and say, "Look at this," had accidentally uncovered one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the history of sentient life. The Ray's vlogs, as they came to be known, became a cultural phenomenon that transcended species and borders and language. They were studied in xenosociology courses at universities across the Union. They were played in schools where children of 100 different species watched a human talk to a predator in a soft voice, and learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to be kind in the presence of it. They were quoted in political speeches and academic papers and late-night conversations between friends. The phrase "hit record" became slang across the Union for the act of refusing to be silenced, for standing up and bearing witness when powerful forces wanted you to disappear. Young beings of every species spray-painted it on walls and printed it on clothing and said it to each other when they were afraid. And it meant, "I am here. I am watching. I am not going away." Javan graduated from the Aegis Academy 2 years after his return from Calith 9. He finished top of his tactical class, which surprised no one, and middling in astrogation, which surprised no one either because he never could make sense of Dralith star charts, and he spent most of those lectures feeding Mala treats under the desk. He was offered a dozen prestigious postings, command positions on capital ships, advisory roles at Union headquarters, a teaching position at the academy itself. Every door in the galaxy was open to him, and all he had to do was walk through one. He turned them all down. Instead, he requested command of a small exploratory vessel, a scout-class ship with a crew of 12, and a mandate to survey uncontacted worlds and make first assessments of planets the Union had written off as too dangerous or too remote or too strange to bother with. The ship was called the UVS Witness. His crew was a collection of beings that no other captain would have assembled. Tish was his communications officer, because of course he was. Maylis Rowe had retired from the academy and signed on as his tactical advisor, because she said she was bored, but everyone knew it was because she had decided 2 years ago that this human was worth following. The rest were a mix of species and temperaments and skills, outcasts and dreamers and stubborn idealists who had watched the vlogs and wanted to be part of whatever came next. Mala had her own cabin. Javan had tried to set her up in the cargo bay, but she had walked into the first officer's quarters on the first day and refused to leave, and the first officer, a Korathi named Des who had served on the frigate Javan had saved years ago, took one look at the 6-legged predator occupying his bed and quietly moved his things to a smaller room without complaint. On the morning they launched, Javan sat in the captain's chair of the Witness and looked out at the stars through the forward viewport, and the stars looked back with the patient light of 100 billion suns. Behind him, Mala was sprawled across the deck, her plates warm bronze, her breathing slow and content, taking up far more space than was strictly necessary. The bridge crew stepped around her without comment because they had all learned within the first week that Mala went where Mala wanted, and the universe adjusted accordingly. Javan reached under his chair and pulled out the rig. It was battered and scratched, and the adhesive tape on one corner had been replaced twice, and the recording light flickered sometimes before catching, and it was still the most important thing he owned. It was his witness, his memory, his proof that he had been here and that what happened had mattered. He turned it on, and the red light blinked once and held steady. "Captain's log," he said, and he smiled at the absurdity and the wonder of those words coming from his mouth. "Day 1. New ship, new mission, same camera. They told me I was too human for this galaxy." He looked at the stars, and the stars were endless and bright and full of worlds that no one had been brave enough or curious enough or stubborn enough to visit. Turns out the galaxy just was not human enough. He paused, and behind him, Mala lifted her head and made a sound, that low, warm hum that meant here and safe and mine. And Javan looked at the camera, and his eyes were bright with something that was not tears but was close. "She says hi." He grinned the same grin he had grinned on day 1 in the jungle of Calith 9 when the world was trying to kill him, and he had decided to keep going anyway. The grin that said, "I am here, and I am not afraid, and whatever comes next I will face it with my eyes open, and my hands out, and my heart doing the stupid brave thing it has always done." He hit record. and the witness flew forward into the dark, carrying a human and a beast and a story that had changed the galaxy, heading for the unknown with nothing but curiosity and courage, and the stubborn, irrational, beautiful belief that the universe was full of friends they had not met yet. The stars burned ahead of them like a promise, and Javan Rays kept filming,